Here we go, back for another one. It's the Awesemo Fantasy Football Show right here on the Awesemo Fantasy Football channel. Help us get to that 5,000 subscribers mark. We are inches away. We're almost crossing the finish line, and then we'll talk about 10, 15, 20, maybe 100K at some point too. But I'm Dave Loughran at Lofty_D on Twitter. Hit me up, LOUGHY_D. Joined by, as always, well, not as always, but as always on Thursdays, as a matter of fact, back to the Thursday routine, our boy Matt Savoca hanging out with us for the first time this season. I'm telling you, this fella knows his stuff. We had amazing game-by-game marathon breakdowns last year, and I'm very happy to have him with us. Hit him up at Draftaholic on Twitter. Matt, it's time to talk some strategies today.
Yeah, so pumped and thrilled to be back for a second season with Awesemo. And yeah, what's really cool today, some of the stuff should be some evergreen content. Our marathon matchups columns shows they have a shelf life of about 4 days. And with injuries, it's usually left. But this one should be really good, getting you ready for your fantasy drafts all summer long.
I can't wait. And as you guys slowly enter the room, we're going to break it all down. What I mean by strategies today is, and there's no top strategy. It's not like, well, I like this one, but maybe I'll go with this one. I mean, you go into it with an idea of what you're looking to do. But the difference between having one strategy over the other is you have to kind of, at times, let the draft dictate what the best decisions are. And Matt, when we talk about elite running back strategy, what I mean by that is going running backs early, trying to get, two really good running backs on your roster. It doesn't mean you go running back heavy and end with 9 of them, because generally speaking, only 3 of them can ever be in your starting lineup each week, assuming you have a flex. You got zero RB strategy. We know that was popular back in the day. Late round quarterback, late round tight end, and then late round risk, which you brought up, and I think it'll be great to talk about. But as we dive into it, starting with elite running back approach, this has been something that I've looked to do a lot this year, specifically in best ball drafts, because I do believe there's a precipitous drop-off after the first, say, 4 rounds at running back, where you're digging into guys that are in kind of precarious situations. Maybe they're not guaranteed to be bell cows, backfield splits, maybe the million different reasons. So this is one that I've liked to do this season. What about you from in a sense of getting running backs early and often?
Yeah, I think there's even a difference between the first 4 picks, let alone the first 4 rounds.
Sure.
There have been studies that have been done, even updated to this year, this past season of data included, that show that really the only place where positional value for the running back outpaces wide receivers or tight ends or quarterbacks from a positional standpoint is those first 5 running backs. If we were able to just guess who the running backs 1 through 5 would be, that is where you get the most value, the most bang for your buck. So, of course, everyone is going to be hoarding those most obvious plays in those early rounds. And what's kind of nice about that is you can pick, as you've mentioned, less overall running backs, leaving more roster spots to the other positions. So absolutely, especially in tournaments, best ball play on Underdog, I love going running back early because then it frees me up to maybe even pick 10 wide receivers. And you can actually employ this same strategy in your redraft leagues too, just taking a bunch of wide receivers after you feel comfortable with the running back position. And again, that can be dictated by a draft strategy, but as well as your league settings. But just getting 1 or 2 and then getting the rest of the positions can be a very, very winning strategy this year and previous years.
And understanding your league format is so important too. Like if you have 3 wide receivers and 2 running backs without a flex, you could still go running back early, but you got to be careful that you're not. And I see this mistake made so often on Underdog, right? Nick Lepre and I, Notorious Fantasy, did a draft earlier this week, and I talked extensively about it. Like, I love getting running backs early, but if you're somebody that has now drafted 8 running backs in the first 12 rounds, what are you going to do with all of them, right? The same thing goes with quarterbacks. I mean, you see people drafting Kyler Murray, Russell Wilson, and then Matthew Stafford. Only one of them is actually going to fit into your lineup each week. So this is the same thing for season long, at least to the extent that be aware of what your team looks like, what your roster structure, what the settings look like. because if you do have 3 wide receivers and a flex, that means you can start 4 receivers each week. Generally, you can only start 3 running backs each week, but that doesn't mean don't get them early. It just means you don't always need to overload on a position. And another approach I'd like to take with the elite running back approach, grabbing them early, Matt, is, and you kind of touched on it, being able to draft like 10 wide receivers in best ball. But you think of it this way. If I'm spending huge draft capital on let's say, Ezekiel Elliott, and then I'm grabbing Clyde Edwards-Helaire, or I'm grabbing Aaron Jones or Antonio Gibson in the second round. If that's the case, I don't need to worry about landing all of these running backs later, because the assumption is that as long as my early round running backs stay healthy, those 2 guys are going to be in my starting lineup almost every single week, barring a bye or an injury.
Right. Exactly. Elite running back, or hero RB, as I've heard it called this season, is best executed by using those early picks to reconfigure your strategy related to your roster overall, related to roster construction. It allows you to take less overall running backs, as we mentioned, particularly if you found that round 1 pick with another of the top 5 backs, or if you feel like you got a steal in those. Like if you have Clyde Edwards-Helaire ranked really highly this season, you really should lay off. And we'll touch on it later in another strategy part of the show, but it should change how you think about the running backs you take at the end of the draft as well. I'll take different swings when I have taken 2 running backs early or 3 running backs early, looking for more upside. I might even take a pure handcuff of like, say, Christian McCaffrey's backup or something like that, if I didn't get him specifically, just to see if I might be able to get one more running back one later in the season.
Yeah, I'm all about that. We call them handcuffs, but not in the traditional sense. Like, I'm not big on, because I do the same thing. I just put a video out, and the opening was like, hey, this is not me saying handcuff all of your top running backs. So I'm using just the general term, late round running backs, backups that can have that explosive upside. Alexander Madison, if Cook were to go down, Tony Pollard, one that no one likes to talk about because he's still drafted in like the 120, 130 range. Latavius Murray. I don't know how you can't have interest in a guy like this. He already gets 10 touches a game. In the 2 games that Alvin Kamara missed over the last 2 years, Murray was the RB1 and the RB1 by a mile. I'm not saying it happens every week, but the guy's a legitimately good running back. And with no Drew Brees this year, with Jameis Winston or Taysom Hill, whoever it's going to be, and no Michael Thomas for this foreseeable future, that team's going to run like crazy. So they were already had the 4th highest run play percentage last year. So you look over those. You were talking about Chuba Hubbard behind Christian McCaffrey. Get him in the last pick of your draft. There's Darrell Henderson is already primed to be a starter. There's endless examples of guys that when you're drafting 2 top-tier running backs, that you now have the luxury of taking those risks on later in the draft. And I think that's what it comes down to. You don't want to be drafting those guys as like your RB3 or your RB2, because otherwise they're useless. In this sense, if they don't pan out, we still have 2 or 3 good running backs.
Yeah, and the unfortunate truth of fantasy football is sometimes injuries happen, and sometimes injuries happen to players who get used a lot. Those tend to be running backs who are drafted early in our fantasy drafts, and it's really hard to make up for that. But we can't draft as if that's going to happen. And when we start drafting these floor running backs on top of the running backs that we already picked in the early rounds, we're going to lose value at the other positions. It's just going to happen because other players in your league are going to hit on those rounds, and you're going to have missed out.
I agree. So it's an approach right now that I'm all about. It isn't to say it's the only approach, but I do think that wide receiver is a deep position. And if you get the guys like Michael Pittman with an ADP around 100, you're talking about somebody that could be the wide receiver 1 on a good Colts team this year. I think there are a lot of prospective wide receiver options that, I don't want them as my wide receiver 1 or 2, obviously, but you don't have to do that. And that makes things really interesting. A lot of wide receivers out there that can open things up and have legit league winning potential. The guys late in the draft, when you're talking about running back, they have that league winning potential, but there's a caveat. Their starters got to go down. With a lot of these wide receivers, that's not the case. Like, there is a window, there's a path for them to become that guy, albeit on not great teams, maybe not great quarterbacks, but a bad quarterback can support one really good receiver. We've seen it happen in the past.
Absolutely. If you have a path to playing time, you might be valuable, especially in a best ball league where you don't have to pick. Those late round wide receivers are perfect because maybe in garbage time, they get 6 extra targets and they can make their way into your lineup. It's just one of those things that you can absolutely take more risk at running back because you can churn them in the end from the end of your draft onto the waiver wire and redraft league. So it's kind of a win-win there.
0 RB, Matt. This one was like, flavor of the multiple years, really. Not the multiple years when you're talking about what we saw from this. You remember the emergence of the 0 RB approach? Everyone just fell in love with it. The problem is positional strength changes over the years, and it's not always going to be the same. These 0 RB years, it was a time where, like, sure, there were some good running backs, but it's a lot different than now where there are still some really good receivers later in the draft and in the middle rounds. How willing are you to entertain an idea of going 0 running back in the 2021 fantasy drafts?
I'm never forcing it, but I'm never upset when it happens. And really, it comes down to the fact that 0 running back became popular, as you mentioned, in a time where the running back landscape of the NFL was entirely different. I think the running back 1 overall in 2015 was Devonta Freeman. And not to take anything away from Devonta Freeman, but his rest of his career has kind of proven that he was a little bit of a flash in the pan in terms of overall production. Since then, you've had an influx of overall talent with Christian McCaffrey, Joe Mixon, Saquon Barkley, these Jonathan Taylor, and the 2020 class overall looking historic in terms of running back talent. The landscape is just entirely different. And the bottom line is you can still get some of those elite prospects like DeAndre Swift and J.K. Dobbins moving down the board in your draft, taking wide receivers early. The other aspect is, as good as the Awesemo projections or whatever your favorite projections is, we're certainly biased towards the Awesemo ones around here. We have to remember that projections aren't everything in season-long fantasy football. Situations change drastically and quickly in the NFL, and there's just no place that's more evident than at the running back position. I know this isn't the focus of the show, but from a real football perspective, rushing, and in particular the rusher themselves, matters very little to overall running back success. And what's more important is the overall quality of the offense, dictated by the passing game and turnover differential, and the overall quality of that individual's opportunity, meaning are they getting a chance to score touchdowns, or in PPR leagues, do they get chances to catch passes? So we can find those situational specialists who are going to get goal line carries and targets in PPR leagues later in drafts, and they can fill those gaps for us. So it's absolutely viable in 2021, but you can't deny that the talent level in the top rounds of draft is very, very different than what this came to be in the mid 2010s.
You're right, though. Like there are players out there. If you wanted to go 0 RB, let's just say you get put into a scenario where I'll give you an example. So you're picking, I don't know, 10th in the first round, and Tyreek Hill or Devonta Adams is still on the board. And let's say Devonta Adams with Aaron Rodgers, to me, is the wide receiver 1. Personally, I have as wide receiver 1. Assuming that's the case, if you could land Devonta Adams and you think he's better than, say, Austin Eckler and Nick Chubb, and then those guys go and you come back a few picks later and Calvin Ridley or DeAndre Hopkins is still on the board. Now you have Devonta Adams and you have Calvin Ridley. I totally get that. So the question is, when we talk 0 RB, how late are you willing to go before you draft one of those running backs? Because with me, I don't really have any set approach. I don't like most of the 3rd round running backs. I'm not particularly high on DeAndre Swift, and I like Dobbins, but I don't want him as my RB1. I'd feel more comfortable just going like Chris Carson or David Montgomery in all seriousness, or even like a Mike Davis. If I'm going with that no running back in the first few rounds, I'll just drag it out a little bit further. But I'm not trying to have like a James Conner, who I really like late in the drafts, especially because in the Cliff Kingsbury, Kyler Murray era, the running backs have scored 33 touchdowns. So the notion that Kyler Murray is going to vulture everything just isn't the case. And I think James Conner, as we talked about before the show started, gets the goal line work in Arizona over Chase Edmonds. But I don't want those guys as my RB1s and 2s. I think I can still make a good team going wide receiver, and then getting a couple running backs in those middle rounds. I don't think that's impossible or even improbable.
Yeah, I hate to sound like a broken record here, but knowing your league and the roster settings are so important here. There's no reason to push zero RB beyond the starters of your league settings. Never, ever do that. Always pick running backs when you're done picking starters. Now, you can even push it as far as filling that flex spot with another wide receiver, but give it a shot. Take a chance at a cheap best ball draft on Underdog and try to push the running back position as far down the draft board. It feels icky, just as you mentioned, getting those mid-round players who definitely have warts on their profiles. You're not sure exactly how they're going to be used. I think you need to think about zero RB in terms of two facets. One, of course, you're going to be taking risks on higher upside players at the end of your draft. But in the beginning of your running back rounds, whether that's round 5 or 6 or rounds even 8, 9, or 10, you need to think about floor significantly more than ceiling. Players like Nyheim Hines, or when they're healthy, Tariq Cohen, are really helpful in PPR leagues because they can get you that 8 to 10 points that keeps your floor for your running back 2 high enough so that you can use the upside of your wide receivers to win your weeks. I think everyone always thinks about these league-winning players that are at the ends of drafts, the James Robinsons, the Myles Gaskins of last year, but really those are lottery picks. Yes, you're going to take shots on those, but you need to have foundational picks in those mid-rounds that are going to get you beyond a zero, or else this strategy is kaput. It's not going to work for you.
Right. And to add on to that, there's also players later in drafts, and this is contrary to what you're saying, but really applies to the same approach. Later in drafts, if you have the opportunity to take a full fly, like a total flyer on a James Robinson, do that every time over a, like, Devin, to me personally, you can do your own thing, but over, say, like a running back or a wide receiver that's going to give you, I don't know, 6 to 8 points every week, is, especially in best ball, is never going to be in your actual, optimized lineup, in your starting lineup. I'd rather take shots on guys that could be league winners late. And I agree, they're total lottery picks, but I'd rather take lottery picks late than guys where it's like, well, I know what I'm getting from him. He's a solid 6 to 9 fantasy points. I don't really have much interest in that type of floor. Give me the floor in the middle rounds and even in the first round, because the floor accompanies, in most cases, a very high ceiling anyway. So it's a win-win. It's a best of both worlds. But late in the draft, I'm all about taking those flyers because I don't care about the guys that are never going to be in my starting lineup, even though they're moderately involved in the offense and never score touchdowns.
And that's actually one of the nice things about zero RB is you're probably going to be taking more shots than your league mates at the running back position. You're probably going to have more running backs overall than wide receivers in this type of drafting strategy. And yeah, you're going to have more opportunities to hit on those James Robinsons, Myles Gaskins. But just like you said, you're going to be able to take those players who are just good for 4 or 5 points, will never make the starting lineup. You can easily drop them because you're going to have an influx of talent, hopefully, from that mid-round section.
And I'm a Tulsa dog. Our boy always hanging out with us here. What's up, brother? Says, drafting 10 through 12 on Underdog makes it easier to go the RB route. Yeah, it's a good point. Like if you're drafting first, second, third, or fourth, there's 0 point in not grabbing one of those running backs. I know you've tried it. I know you tried it to see how it worked out, right? And I can respect that. But if I have the shot of getting Alvin Kamara or Henry or specifically Kamara, Cook, or McCaffrey, I've just got to pull the trigger on that every single time. For me personally, that's the way I'm going. But later in the first round, and then it snakes back around to you, I do think there is a lot of merit to maybe taking a different approach. And that to me would be where the zero RB comes in.
To his point, though, I will say this year, especially, I've noticed that the way ADP has started to shake out this summer, it usually is like if you're at the 11th or 12th pick, it's a great time to double tap wide receiver, as they say.
Yep.
This year, the wide receivers are getting pushed up a little bit more into the middle of the first. So you could take like a duo of Joe Mixon and Nick Chubb or Austin Eckler and Jonathan Taylor at the end of the first. And having that as a 1-2 punch at the end of the first does feel pretty good.
Sure. And I'm not saying, listen, I've done plenty of videos on saying go running backs early no matter where.
Yeah.
But You know, I have, because I believe that to be a good approach this year with how many good ones we have early and how many bad ones later. But what I'm saying is in the first 4 picks, I'm going running back no matter what. In the, say, last 4 picks, I at least have a decision to make based on what's on the board. You know what I mean? Like that, I know what's going to be there for me in the first 4 picks. I don't necessarily know what's going to be there 8 through or 9 through 12. And, you know, if an Adams is there and I can come back and get a Ridley or a Hopkins, I feel pretty good about that. But I'd also feel great with an Eckler and then a Chubb on the other side too. So, yeah. All right, let's talk about late round quarterback, Matt. This one really shouldn't take all that long because, well, you know what? Maybe it will because you and I guess, have slightly different approaches and you have some good ideas here in the middle rounds. But I've always advocated, at least in recent years, for at least entertaining the idea that you can get good quarterbacks later in a draft. I'm not saying wait till the 15th round, but there are so many viable quarterbacks that can give you big weeks, like a Matt Ryan as the QB 15 or a Matthew Stafford as the QB 12, that I do think if you want to load up on skill players, it's very much a viable approach to wait on quarterbacks.
100%. And there's been literal books written about late round quarterbacks. The strategy has been viable year after year after year, especially over the last decade, where similar to the running back position, the quarterback talent of the league in general continues to rise, making so that fantasy gamers can wait in drafts, get those other starter positions locked in, and then focus on their quarterback. Remember, fantasy football is a weekly game. So I actually looked at a study from Sharp Football Analysis's Rich Rebar, and he found that 30% of the quarterback player pool drafted in fantasy drafts over the last decade had 7 or more starter caliber weeks. That's top 12 at the position. Wow. And 60% of drafted quarterbacks had 4 or more usable weeks. And as you would expect, that's significantly higher than all other positions in fantasy football. So if your league does not place a premium on the quarterback position, like you're not playing a 2-quarterback league or a super flex, you're simply better off accumulating players at positions where you really have to kind of win the lottery to get that same level of production later in drafts. You can absolutely get starter quality quarterback play in those later rounds. You simply can't say that about other positions.
Exactly. And that's what the range of outcomes for like drafting a quarterback in the 5th round compared to in the 10th round, compared to drafting like a running back in the 5th compared to the 10th. It's pretty dramatic. So yeah, that for sure. Now the thing I wanted to talk about with you is you did talk about before we got started, you and I were having a conversation because we just enjoy talking football, but you had talked about start that run. If it's possible, if you can see it coming, start that run on quarterbacks, the lower end. I'd almost say like the middle range of quarterback ones in the 6th or 7th round is where we're seeing this happen.
Yeah. And I actually have a note here that quarterback often is a market unto itself within a draft. So I think an important question to really ask yourself going into your own draft is, where do you think those quarterback inflection points are going to be for your draft? Where do you think that proverbial run on quarterbacks is going to happen? And just try to anticipate it, not necessarily participate in it. If you've picked a quarterback early, or if you feel like this is a year to really wait because there are some exciting rookies at the end of drafts. But I think really this year, especially, you can find quarterbacks with QB1 overall potential sitting at the quarterback 8, 9, or 10. I think it's a little bit more murky when you get to quarterback 14, 15, 16, 17, like that. So I'm slightly encouraging fantasy gamers to try to guess when that run is going to happen and get those later round quarterback ones, your Tom Brady's, your Ryan Tannehill's, your Russell Wilson's. There's going to be 5 or 6 players at the position taken ahead of them. And also do a little bit of your own research. If quarterbacks are going earlier in the draft than you expected, but a specific player that you love is falling positionally, then take a chance on them, even though it might be a little bit early in terms of overall pick.
Yeah, great stuff. And I totally agree. One thing too is when you're talking about best ball, the stacking approach, I love some of these lower end quarterback ones like Tannehill, because if I want to grab Julio Jones in the 4th, I can grab Tannehill in the 10th or the 9th. When you're talking about a Chief stack, if you want a Chief stack, let's say you want a 3-player Chiefs stack of the top guys, your first 3 picks are all going to be Chiefs. It's just the way it is. Or 2 of your top 3, and then maybe you get like a Mecole Hardman or a Byron Pringle a little bit later. Fine. But there are some really great options out there where if you have Ridley or you have Pitts, you can get Ryan later. If you wanted to grab Woods or Cooper Kupp, who are in those, later early rounds, you can grab Matthew Stafford in the 10th or wherever he's going. So that's just another wrinkle to all of this, where there are some great stacks with good quarterbacks and even better pass catchers where you don't have to waste, or no, I shouldn't say waste, but you don't have to spend a ton of draft capital to make that work as you would have to with like a Josh Allen and a Stefan Diggs or a Patrick Mahomes and a Tyreek Hill. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And I'm a Tulsa Dog asked, he's asking you, how much stock do you put in stacking in best ball, like on Underdog? Obviously I'm all about stacking on best ball.
Especially if it's the tournament types that have become very, very popular this year on Underdog, like the Best Ball Mania tournaments or the Puppy tournament. Those are stack or bust kinds of plays for me. I'm trying to create weird stacks because it's going to be a ton of people, but
this is a good point though that you're making. The tournament size is a huge differentiator in whether to, go ahead.
Yeah, I've made some ugly stacks in those big tournaments because I want to just have a stack that's different from the group. But in those types of plays, do I stack, yes or no? The answer is 99.9% yes. Yep. In a traditional 12-team league, I'll try to do it, but I'll never force it, is really how I feel.
And that's a good question, or a good answer to Lundar's question. Would you lean grabbing a top 5 quarterback if you have his wide receiver 1? I like to wait, but yesterday took Diggs at 10, felt kind of compelled to take Allen at his ADP. Thanks, guys. Listen, having Allen and Diggs stack is never a bad thing. I'm not by any stretch suggesting that like, oh man, if you get Diggs, you shouldn't stack Allen with him. That's not what I'm saying at all. Plus, you can grab like a Gabriel Davis a little bit later in the draft. If you want to go crazy, take Dawson Knox with your last pick. Like there are ways, or Emmanuel Sanders, to stack Buffalo and double stack them, but also have Diggs. That's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is there's some more affordable stacks that you can get to. But no, I mean, I have no problem if you have Diggs grabbing Allen. But another thing, Matt, is you don't have to stack your top receiver. You could stack your wide receiver 2 or 3 or 4, maybe even your 4 and 5 receiver from the same team, and you stack like, there's plenty of ways to do it. I don't think you absolutely have to make sure, and it's not going to happen anyway, that if you have Metcalf, you get Wilson, or that you have Diggs, that you get Josh Allen, or Travis Kelce, that you have Mahomes. It's just not always feasible.
Well, let's actually talk about what happens when you choose to stack in a season-long fantasy football league. What ends up happening is when those teams that you have the quarterback and the wide receiver for, when they do well, when they score a lot of points, your team is going to score a lot of points. The ceiling, your weekly ceiling, is going to increase. But the inverse is also true. When those players do poorly, they're probably going to do poorly together. So I have actually heard some arguments that in best ball tournaments, that negative correlation is equally valuable as positive correlation, because you just want correlation so that when your lineups, one group does poorly, the other group can make their way into the lineup. And if they both do great, then obviously they're all going to make their way into the lineup. So I think you just have to think about your league mates in this situation. Are they traditionally people who are grinding the waiver wire and you're not going to get those players? Because then on those down weeks when your team doesn't do very well, it's going to be tough to grind out a win. Or do you usually breeze into the playoffs, in which case, take the stack, enjoy those big winning weeks where you score 20 more than your league. So there's upsides and downsides for sure.
Yep. And I guess I'll say this one last thing on this point is when you have a Josh Allen and Stefan Diggs, a lot of those weeks they're gonna be in there because you just have like 2 elite players that will have more good weeks than bad. That's not the case with every stack. It doesn't need to be. And sometimes you can protect against that. Maybe you have a real good stack and then you take a flyer on a lower end stack. Plenty of ways to do it. But like you said, man, stack as much as you possibly can in the big tournaments. And then in the smaller one, like a 12-team best ball league, if you can, sure. If you can't, don't force it to the point where you're making bad stacks and making bad picks and reaching. just because you want to have those stacks in there. I think it's that simple.
Just to circle back to the overall strategy point of late round QB, I think one thing to remember this year, especially too, is there are some really highly coveted rookies who don't look like they're going to get the starting gig from day one. But if you take a late round quarterback, say a Ben Roethlisberger or a Ryan Fitzpatrick, or even a Kirk Cousins who looks to have a very soft schedule to begin the season, just to get to middle of the season where Justin Fields or Trey Lance or even Mac Jones could be starting for you, that means you can spend tons of draft capital, a dozen rounds maybe, on other positions, which could be a huge advantage for you.
Absolutely. And the truth is, Kirk Cousins and Ben Roethlisberger are not going to be league winners, but Kirk Cousins and Ben Roethlisberger generally aren't going to hurt you either, because you have to at least consider what you're getting by passing up on quarterback until later in that draft. You're getting really good skill players and more than other people who are drafting quarterbacks early. But Justin Fields and Trey Lance do have legitimate league winning potential with their dual threat upside, rushing upside. And, Justin Fields is a pass first quarterback. No one ever talks about that, but the guy's an accurate quarterback. He's got Allen Robinson. Darnell Mooney should have a better season coming into his second campaign. And we'll see. Maybe David Montgomery can keep it up. Even Tariq Cohen, having him out of the backfield. Like, these guys could have huge, huge years. You're drafting them outside of the top 12. And like you said, Matt, maybe you wait on them. Maybe you wait to get a Roethlisberger, or Matt Ryan's another example of that. Like, you could still wait a long time to get him. A lot of these guys are still going to be viable starters each week. You're not going to feel awful starting them. If you have Trey Lance and Justin Fields waiting in the wings, you could have an absolutely destructive team when they inevitably take over. Because I can assure you, Andy Dalton is not going to be the starter in week 17, unless of course they're out or already into the playoffs and he's just in there to toss shit around and not make a fool of himself. So
we are aligned there.
Yeah, I would hope so. Garoppolo for me is a little bit different because I think the Niners can still have a good season with a strong run game, offensive line, a healthy defense. Like, I think Garoppolo could manage that team and they still win a lot of games, but there are going to be cries for Trey Lance the moment he has a bad game, for when Garoppolo has his first bad game.
I mean, Trey Lance is an early contender for the paper plate award of Patrick Mahomes in 2017. The player who is going to transform their team, but not this year.
Yep, it's possible. Or Lamar Jackson in his rookie season he came in with 6 or 7 games to play and won everybody's league. If you picked Lamar Jackson up off the waiver wire and you just absolutely crushed it. Jalen Hurts last 4 games last year, outside of that game against Washington where they intentionally lost, he was winning playoff games for you. Jalen Hurts, no doubt about it, racking up 30+ fantasy points per game. There is the same kind of potential here with Fields and Trey Lance, no doubt about it. So late round quarterback in the books. Let's get to these last 2, late round tight end and late round risks. Stick around for that. It's a super important one if you don't know what we're talking about. But first, we talk a lot about best ball, a lot about Underdog Fantasy. It is the best place you're going to draft in best ball for sure. They have a $3.5 million tournament right now, $1,001 to first. It's the biggest best ball tournament ever. They've got a lot of other great stuff. The puppy filled up already. I would imagine that they're going to have another one.
I saw their social media said in August it's launching.
Okay. I mean, I figured they have to. It filled up so quick, and that was in July, right? $50K to first, $5 to enter. It's awesome. You could do as many as you want. Same with the 25 to enter, $3.5 million best ball tournament. And they've got smaller leagues as well. Whatever you want to do, it's awesome. The UI is awesome. You want to draft on your laptop, your desktop, your iPad, your iPhone, your Droid, whatever. Awesome app, all of that. Use the promo code Awesemo, AWESEMO. You'll get $25 when you sign up and deposit. Take advantage of that. Take advantage of the promo. Do some drafts over there. I know all of our guys in chat have been drafted on Underdog already, but if you haven't, it's awesome. Even if you want to wait till later in the year where you have more clarity on scenarios, fine. But use that promo code Awesemo when you do. Don't miss out on getting the $25 into your account to use wherever the hell you want. You want to get 5 entries into the puppy? Sure. You want to put 1 into the Millionaire Maker tournament? Well, sorry, the $1 million to first tournament? Do that as well. Promo code Awesemo, underdogfantasy.com. Great place to play best ball right now. All right, Matt. So we've gotten through 3 of these topics. Now, late round tight end shouldn't take all that long. And I'm kind of ambivalent when it comes to this. If I can land a good tight end, I will. If I don't land one of the top tight ends, though, I would probably like to wait. But I have teams that have Hawkinson. Like, I think he could be 1,000-yard tight end this year. I have some teams with Waller. I don't have many with Kelsey because I haven't been put in that spot. But then I have plenty with Dallas Goedert. That's before Zach Ertz reported to camp with blonde hair. And I have some with Tyler Higbee because with Gerald Everett gone, I like that too. And then I have some where I forego is a word. Is forwent a word?
I have no idea.
Because it wouldn't be foregoed.
I forewent.
It sounds
right.
I
happened to forego.
Right. Is it a word, Jordan? I forewent. Never used it before, but it just sounded right. I forewent getting any of those guys because the draft just didn't work in my favor. And then I grabbed, this is best ball, of course, but then I grabbed like 3 later round guys, hoping that each week one of them can give me decent production. So again, kind of ambivalent here, but curious to hear your thoughts because we haven't personally, the two of us, discussed this yet.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, this is the highest I've really ever seen a tight end really drift in the first round. There was a couple of years where Gronk was, considered a late first round pick, but Kelsey is like a surefire mid round. That's a first for me. And, this is an alternative gripe for another show, but one of the stats that I've seen really percolate around the fantasy football world this year more than ever is win rate or seasonal win rate. Yeah. I think it's because best ball data has been released, especially from the tournaments last year. And I just want to caution people where they see that stat, and nothing against the people who use it. It's still a very good stat. Seasonal win rates can be wildly affected by individual player performance. And there's no other position where that's been more true than with tight end, where Travis Kelsey is pushing up the win rates of these early round tight ends based on these small sample sizes. And we've actually been spoiled over the last really 10 years with tight end talent from even the end of like Tony Gonzalez's career in 2012 to Jimmy Graham, Gronk, and now Kelsey, and then there's a new generation of Kittle,
Gates
Waller.
Before that.
Yeah, just an incredible decade really for the tight end position, changing the way it's been used in the passing game. And the bottom line is, while we're getting better at identifying which young players are going to enter that top tier, we still aren't great at guessing the availability for these top tight ends because the position is so grueling. It tends to be a position similar to running back where the top players miss time. We saw it for many years with Gronk. And I actually did a study that in 2018, that if you just group the top 3 tight ends in positional ADP, from a probability standpoint, you have the same chance of your top 3 tight end playing 6 games as you do 16. From a probability standpoint, it's the exact same thing. So there's a ton to lose because people in your drafts are taking those top tier running backs while you take a tight end, and they're going to get that production. So why not wait and just get a similar amount of production later?
Okay. Coming with the heat, Matt.
Yeah, I got a lot to say.
I'm glad to have you back. So there's such a precipitous drop off though from these top couple tight ends. Like you could even make the argument, first of all, Travis Kelsey's in a tier of his own, right? He's tier 1. Like I would, do you agree or no? Like clear tier of his own, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. And then there's Darren Waller. But the question is like George Kittle. What tier is he? Is Kittle in a tier of his own? Tier 3? And then we drop to tier 4? Or would you put Kittle in the same tier as Darren Waller this season? Because people are down on George Kittle this season, it seems. I've seen him in a lot of bust videos and bust articles. The guy is still an absurdly talented tight end. Jimmy Garoppolo and him have a love affair on the football field, assuming Garoppolo is the starter. And I know you have Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel and a run-heavy approach, but like, because I've talked about this ad nauseum, we need to hear your opinion on it. Where does George Kittle settle in for you? And are you willing to take him where he's going in that mid to late second round?
Yeah, the question you should be asking yourself is, am I okay with my second round pick being a tight end? I personally think George Kittle fits that mold if your answer to that previous question is yes.
Right.
So I have them in the exact same tier. I would be comfortable taking them, especially in best ball, at the very end of the second round. Obviously, I much prefer if I can get them at a value. I just think George Kittle is as talented as I believe Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel is. And I do think the overall quality of the San Francisco passing game, it has a lot of upside for sure. Kittle is still far and away the best receiver on that team,
No
maybe
question.
even the best player on that team. So to put him third at his position overall, it almost feels like a little bit disrespectful. So to me, he looks like a second round pick. I'm okay with that. If you want to draw the line elsewhere, I completely respect that.
Yeah. Look, I don't really have anything to add outside of this. George Kittle was injured for a lot of the season last year. If you were to just prorate his numbers to 16 games, you're talking about almost 1,300 yards. I'm not saying you can just do that, but he's played 15, 16, and 14 games in his previous 3 seasons. It's not like he has a notable history of injuries where he's just never on the field. That's not the case. The thing I hate about Kittle is he's just not been used a ton inside the red zone. How many touchdowns do you think is the most he's had in a season, Matt?
I'm going to say 6.
5.
That's unbelievable.
That's unbelievable, right? It's the most he's had in a season. George Kittle, a guy who racked up almost 1,400 yards in 2018, almost 1,100 yards in 2019, and last year, 634 in only 8 games. But he was he was on pace for 130 targets almost. Like, that was with terrible quarterbacking as well. So I have softened a bit on my Kittle approach, and I think it's a little bit overblown that people are drafting. In some spots, I'm seeing Waller go a full round or more ahead of of Kittle, and that is a little bit strange.
Sense. Yeah,
but in home leagues, because in best ball leagues, I'm willing to take those shots on late round tight ends. What about in home leagues for you, Matt? If you don't get one of the top, say, 3 tight ends, then you're coming up on guys like Pitts and Hawkinson and Mark Andrews, who I'm not particularly high on this year. Then you get to the Goddards and the the Goddards and the Tyler Higbee group, right? There's these tiers. And then it falls off to where you're just taking shots on guys you hope that they're good enough. What is your home league approach, or say 12-team PPR or half-point PPR approach with a standard roster with 1 flex and 1 tight end?
I think I'm taking the barbell approach. I'm either going with those top 3 guys or I'm waiting. I know Kyle Pitts is an amazing talent, and I really believe in him long-term. But with his positional ADP, if you look at what traditionally that positional ADP has done in terms of production, Kyle Pitts could have the greatest rookie tight end season in history and still underperform his positional ADP. And while I love TJ Hawkinson, and I think he's also a transcendent talent at the position, there is a lot of question marks at the overall Detroit offense. They may not be able to get to the red zone enough, and we really want touchdowns from our tight ends. That's why we were griping so much about George Kittle just a moment ago. So I'm tending to lean towards those top tier talents in the beginning rounds, or I love players who are on prolific offenses, but that happen to be going late. I know he got injured last year, but I think Blake Jarwin fits that role really well. He's going to be on the field a ton for a Dallas offense that could easily lead the league in points per game. You can find these talented and players who have opportunity consistently later in drafts, although with the tight end, it's always going to vary. You're always going to get more fluctuation in their scores. It's just about being a little bit better than average for the position compared to your league.
One more thing on George Kittle before we move on. I was just looking something up right now. I remember many games 2 years ago and last year even, where Kittle had touchdowns called back on like offensive holding and just stupid stuff. So I look at this, and I'm not including last year, but 2 years ago, George Kittle was second at his position in targets inside the 10-yard line, 4th in red zone targets at the tight end position. 2018, he was 3rd in targets at the tight end position. So if that's any indication at all, especially given that he's a guy who can rip off long receptions, he's not just a 0 yards after the catch guy. You have to think that you see positive regression for touchdowns this season if he continues to get opportunities inside the red zone. Just throwing that out there.
Absolutely agree.
All right, Matt. Oh, and hey, like this video if you haven't done so yet. Greatly appreciated. It helps us with that YouTube algorithm. If you like what we do here, you think this content along the way may have helped you a little bit, maybe you just like Matt Savoca so much that you want to give us a thumbs up and show that support. Subscribe to the channel too. We are currently at, Matt, I think we're almost there. We've been gaining subscribers like crazy lately, thanks to you guys hanging out and appreciating, I guess, our work. We're at 4.98 thousand. So we are almost there. We're like less than 20 away from hitting that 5,000 subscriber mark. Get us there. We would appreciate it very much so. And, subscribe, hit that thumbs up. Thanks, guys. And girls, whoever's watching. I don't care who's watching as long as you're here.
Hey, just to add one last thing to what
man.
we were saying. Touchdown rate, that is TDs per target for tight ends, has a correlation of 0.07. It is completely random year to year. That's a study done over the last 10 years of data. So I really can't say it's a trend at all for George Kittle or really any tight end who has a bad TD rate that it's a long-term trend for them. It's pretty random.
So are you saying Robert Tunyon's 19% touchdown rate from last year isn't sustainable?
I think it may regress to the mean. I will say that.
19%.
Unbelievable, though.
That's crazy. Crazy. And he had like an 86% reception rate as well. Just absolutely absurd. All right. Last topic here, Matt, before we head out for the day. And thanks to all you guys for hanging with us on a Thursday afternoon. Late round risk. What's that mean? Is it even a strategy? Well, let me lay it out for you. And I think I said this to you in Slack today. That's something that really bothers me is when people go, I was just reading an article today, someone saying this. When people go, risk is a necessary element of, and I'm just, doctoring up these words because I'll make it sound better, but risk is a necessary element to winning fantasy football leagues. And then there's just no context to it. It's like, yeah, risk is necessary, but how are you not discerning between late round risk and first round risk? And this was actually an article suggesting that all of the risk to drafting Saquon Barkley in the first round is justified because you have to take risk. Not mentioning that if Saquon Barkley, and you can do what you want, but if he's not there for week one, or if he's not fully healthy, or if he's in an early timeshare with Devontae Booker, that, okay, the risk didn't pay off, but you could have drafted one or two or three or four or five other guys in the same spot that are first round potential league winners that already have a high floor and a high ceiling. Just throwing that out there, Matt, to set this up. There is a big difference between early and late round and even mid round risk in fantasy football.
Oh, there sure is. And the bottom line is, if you could summarize it into one sentence, is your roster needs a balance of proven production and upside that you can articulate. It doesn't mean that has to happen. It just means that you can tell the story where this player at the end of your draft typically does better. I know nobody likes to hear about individual fantasy teams, but I had a team where every single player in the first 10 rounds drafted last year has a higher average draft position this season than they do last season.
Impressive.
That team began the season 0-9. Everybody wanted those players at the end of the season, as did I, but I was already out of contention because I had focused too much on upside, on ceiling, and too little in the early rounds on overall production and proven production. And sometimes that means avoiding a player who is getting an injury-based dip, or avoiding a rookie who you believe in and have drafted in multiple dynasty drafts already, because you need proven production before you can take those calculated risks. I was waiting for you to say the caveat that makes people sound smarter. I'm taking risks, but they're calculated risks. So that's what you need to do. Right. We're trying to articulate that for you now. Get yourself proven production. If you've listened to any of our matchups shows, you know I love expected fantasy points and as a guide for proven production, and then focus on upside later in your drafts.
For sure. And in so many ways, that is exactly what I'm saying. It's calculated risk. Like, I'll give you an example here. If I'm taking Michael Pittman hasn't shown anything yet at the NFL level, right? He had 500 yards or so. I think he had one touchdown in his rookie season. And Carson Wentz is it's a reclamation project. We don't know if he's going to be good or not again. He's got Frank Reich. I'm willing to bet that he's better than last year, where he was borderline unsalvageable, right? But Michael Pittman, in a lot of your home leagues, and not even just home leagues, like a lot of your Underdog can can be misleading. You got a lot of sharp people, especially earlier in the summer drafting there, which is going to set the ADP for guys that we like a lot higher than it will be elsewhere. Go look at ADP on like ESPN or Yahoo or CBS and compare it to Underdog. You're going to be like, oh my God, I've been drafting on Underdog this whole time. I should smoke these drafts because of where a lot of the ADPs are. Pittman, in a lot of spots, I could pull it up right now, and I'm just using him as an example. Pittman, you can get, okay, FFPC 109, ESPN is ADP's 142 right now, CBS 128. Even if you average everything out, including Underdog, 114 ADP for Pittman. That phenomenal calculated risk for me, because he could be the wide receiver one. T.Y. Hilton was awful last year till the end of the year. It was his worst full season ever. Paris Campbell's played 9 games in 2 seasons. Pittman could be a legitimate wide receiver one, a big body receiver that can catch passes, that can cut or in the end zone, that can make the contested catch, has a nice catch radius. Guys like that. Guys like Russell Gage or even Gabriel Davis, if he becomes the wide receiver 2 in Buffalo, and Cole Beasley hangs it up because he doesn't want to get vaxxed. There are a lot of great calculated risks you can make later in the draft, Matt, that could legitimately be every single week starters if you're getting them right. And you don't have to get them all right, by the way. You're never going to get them all right.
That's right. You're just taking a couple of flyers that you're probably going to churn over the course of the year as we get more and more information as the weeks go on. The thing to remember here is that breakout players in fantasy football, as in the vast majority, tend to come from the pool of unproven prospects, usually on rookie deals, previously buried behind veterans on their depth charts. And so now, whether it's free agency or injuries or both, they now have that opportunity. And what's really interesting, if you look at positions and you look at their yearly cohorts, the second year wide receiver cohort, I believe Michael Pittman is part of as this year, they actually on average earn more fantasy points than they did the previous season. That's not the case for third year receivers, fourth year receivers, fifth year receivers, 6th or 7th, all the way through 10th year receivers. I think the reason is because for most teams, that second season is, okay, you've been in our system for a year, show us what you got. Yeah. And I think Pittman is in a perfect situation where the Colts need to do that early on, utilize him as what they believe they drafted him as. And if he can't do it, then they need to make a change probably next offseason. So we want to take flyers on these players who are in those positions on their teams. So Pittman is a great choice. There are a ton of them later in drafts, but there are also players who are in their 4th or 5th seasons, but we know that they're going to have proven production. I always think of Tyler Boyd. Obviously, Jamar Chase is a great talent, and T. Higgins is a player that I believe in long-term. But Tyler Boyd is going to give you enough floor in the middle rounds of your wide receiver starters to let you take more flyers at the ends of drafts, like your Mecole Hardmans or
Henry Ruggs.
Yeah. Exactly. And to just take a chance and see if you have a wide receiver 1 by the end of the year.
Absolutely. There are so many good late round flyers, particularly at the wide receiver position. And there's some at the tight end position too. Adam Troutman being one of them in New Orleans. I could go down a list. Like, there are so many good ones that you don't need to take on significant risk early in the draft. I would actually ask you, what is the point? You're already drafting massive high ceiling, high floor players. Is it worthwhile? Well, if you were to say, yeah, but Laffy, Saquon Barkley fell into the 2nd round. Totally different for me. I don't know where it is for you. Maybe you'd still pass him up. But to me, outside of a select few players where I know that their floor is as high as their ceiling, and they're just not, they have like very small range of outcomes each week, and not in a good way. Like 4 to 6, 5 to 7 fantasy points. I don't want that. But if there's a guy that I know can be absurdly good, and he's slipping down in the drafts, and he's someone that I don't want at his ADP, but he falls, I'm willing to do that. Tyreek Hill was a question mark a couple of years ago. He was going in the 6th and 7th and 5th rounds. He ended up being one of the reasons you won your league, because you got a bona fide, clear-cut 1st round pick in the 5th, 6th, or 7th round. So there's always a spot to take someone. Michael Thomas, there will be a spot to draft Michael Thomas. If someone tells you don't draft Michael Thomas this year, never listen to a thing that they say again. Because if Michael Thomas falls to the 10th round and it's between him or, Jalen Waddle, I still want Michael Thomas, because I'm not risking anything there. So it's important to me, Matt, to always look at this in context and with calculated, as you're saying. Just because I think someone might be a bust at their ADP or I don't want them there doesn't mean that if everyone else in my draft has the exact same opinion as me, I'm probably going to be able to get them way later when taking on way less risk and providing myself with a lot more upside.
If you could sum it up into one sentence, don't hate the player, hate their draft position.
Oh, yeah, of course. The age-old saying. Yeah.
The age-old saying. So if there is one thing you should consider as well, though, is if a player happens to be falling way below their draft position, you should assume that the league is pricing them correctly. So don't change your draft strategy long-term or overall saying, I got this absolute steal. Now you may have, but you should draft as if that risk that the rest of the league baked in, that let that player fall. I think Saquon Barkley is a perfect example, is the correct evaluation, even if your projections say something else. That will help you be conservative enough with the position to fill out the starter positions. But then at the end, you're still going to be filling it out with riskier, higher upside plays so that you can win your league overall.
For sure. I guess what I'm saying, though, is there will always be a time, and this isn't with every player. Sometimes people will reach, but there will always be time. There is always a spot, put it this way, where a player can become a value. There's always a point where he can become a value. If some of these players that we don't like end up dropping really far, and like you said, you should be baking that in, just the overall perception of a Barkley or something like that. But if they fall far enough, I'm willing to roll the dice there. And another thing too, Matt, it's also worthwhile to consider what they're being drafted around. That's the easiest way to evaluate someone in some sense when you don't know where they should be going because they have question marks. Ask yourself, all right, well, if Saquon Barkley is being drafted alongside this player and this player, could I still draft one of these players other than Saquon Barkley and be in a really good spot? If you get to a point where it's like, man, Barkley here is so much better if healthy than both of these two players, like wildly better, then it might be a time to say, all right, this is where I'll take the shot.
Yeah, and know your league as well, especially with players who might miss a few weeks. I know with Thomas, we're talking maybe more than a few weeks.
Yeah.
And you have an IR slot, then they are more valuable because you can fill that out with another flyer pick at the end of your draft. Not to say you need to push them up to they are healthy range, but just they should be slightly more valuable. Again, just know your league.
Absolutely. This has been fun, man. 5 up, 5 down. Could have kept going.
As usual, we could have gone 90 minutes easy.
Oh, easily. Hang out with us every strategy show during the DFS season over at the main Awesemo channel. We do NFL strategy shows every day of the week. We got a ton. I mean, if you're not playing DFS at this point as well, you're crazy. Combine the two, fantasy football right here on the Fantasy Football channel. Help us get the 5K subs and hit that thumbs up. And check us out over at our main channel, Awesemo DFS. We got a lot going on over there all the time. Baseball, basketball's over now, PGA, DFS, for everything. Doesn't matter. Check it out for yourself. We'll be back with you next time, and use that promo code Awesemo when you sign up at Underdog Fantasy. Get your $25 free and get in some of those best ball drafts. Follow Matt at Draftaholic, myself at Lafayette_D, and we'll catch you back here to close out the week tomorrow on the Awesemo Fantasy Football Show. Peace.